The discovery at the State Historical Office. The drawer was supposed to be sealed. It was one of those industrial-grade cabinets that held the kind of artifacts no one was quite sure how to catalogue, too strange for the public archive, too inconclusive for outright disposal. Inside, among brittle envelopes and mislabeled folders, sat a journal, long thought complete, long thought irrelevant. It had been shelved years ago after a perfunctory review labeled it inconclusive field documentation. No one now admits who ordered it uncrated for recataloguing. When the lid came off and the leather binding was touched again, there was nothing remarkable to see. That is, until the archivist turned to page 42. The page had been logged as blank for decades, a pale rectangle of faint stain and brittle pulp. Now in the center, words had bloomed in fresh, dark ink. The letters stood on the page like intruders, tacky to the touch, the edges glistening faintly in the dim light of the cataloguing room. No one could explain how writing had appeared on a paper that, according to storage records, had not been opened in over a decade. The archivist, trained to preserve rather than interpret, wrote his notes in the flat, bloodless tone of officialdom ink, still wet along edges. Fresh application inconsistent with prior documentation. But the handwriting was anything but flat. It didn't match any one style from the known case files. It was as if someone had taken fragments from different authors, stitching them together into a coherent but alien script. When handwriting analysis came later, experts agreed it was not a forgery in the conventional sense. The curves, the pressure, the slant all bore the telltale muscle memory of long practice. But of whose hand, that was the question no one could answer. At the bottom of the page, beneath the main body of writing, was a single line in darker ink, so dark it should not have survived if it had been written in the 19th century. We left together, but not from the same place. There was no signature, no indication of who had opened the journal, who had written it, or who had sealed it again. The entry was dated August 14, 1859, the day 4 young men were declared missing in the Adirondack wilderness. That date was a wound in the state's historical record reopening without permission. The office followed procedure. The journal was resealed, a file was updated, and the object returned to storage. But among the archivists, a quiet unease settled in. Some swore they had passed the page many times before, always blank. Others claimed they remembered faint markings, nothing legible. The truth lay in that uncomfortable space between memory and evidence, a space the journal seemed to occupy with deliberate patience. Outside the walls of the archive, the name of the missing men had all but faded into regional folklore. But the reappearance of fresh ink on an old page meant one thing: the story was not done telling itself. A fire in the mountains. The fire was not an accident. State forestry records from the summer of 1902 describe it. Clinically, controlled burn, Western Plateau, per state supervision. No mention of the dry wind that made the flames leap higher than intended, or the way the smoke clung to the granite ridge. Crews worked methodically, clearing half a century's worth of undergrowth, their shovels and rakes cutting into soil untouched since before the Civil War. On the third day, the team reached a narrow plateau where the pines grew in unnatural spirals. Their rings wound too tight for the species, the bark strained as if resisting something beneath. No one spoke of it. The chainsaws idled, the matches struck, and fire ran across the ground in a low, devouring wave. By the next morning, the plateau was a smear of ash and blackened trunks. It was a fireman named Coleman who saw it just a corner of iron protruding from the soil where a birch had fallen. The object was square, riveted, heavy, and astonishingly intact despite the heat. There was no lock, just a rusted hinge that resisted before giving way with a groan. Inside lay a leather-bound field journal. Its cover was blistered, curling at the edges, but when Coleman thumbed it open, the pages were untouched by flame. Forestry procedure dictated all artifacts be turned over to the Bureau. The journal was boxed, labeled, and sent to Albany. And then nothing. It sat for 3 weeks in an intake queue, unacknowledged, until an archivist finally logged it. The man's initial note, later redacted, read, "Container does not match any known federal or state expedition manifest. Paper fibers test consistent with mid-19th century." Possible fabrication, though content predates known expedition activity in the sector. 41 entries filled the journal. Each bore a set of initials, none in the same hand. Only one name appeared more than once, Francis Dow. 3 other names were scattered among the pages, sometimes as companions, sometimes as witnesses, and in one chilling instance, as if observed from a distance. On the final page in faint graphite was a line without date or location: "You cannot rewalk what was never truly walked." The handwriting was deliberate but light, as though whoever wrote it wanted the words to sit on the paper without sinking in. The journal was shelved, but the way it had survived, sealed in a tin in the middle of a burn zone, unscarred while everything around it turned to cinder, was not the kind of detail that archivists forget. The 4 names. Their families were the sort to appear in the society pages of Albany newspapers: doctors, lawyers, men with lodge pins on their lapels, and wives who chaired parish teas. In the ledgers of Union College and the Albany Academy, the names Samuel Horth, Miles Pomeroy, Francis Dow, and Elias Grant appeared in neat copper plate. In the years before their disappearance, not one of them drew notice for scandal, debt, or illness. They were childhood acquaintances, thrown together in the genteel orbit of their parents' professions. Over the years, their paths diverged: Samuel to medicine, Miles to cartography, Elias to mechanical tinkering, and Francis to a kind of drifting academic quietude. In the late summer of 1859, their correspondence reveals a convergence, a longing not for the wild in the romantic sense, but for something unstructured. One of Samuel's notes, later attached to a missing persons affidavit, read, "To remove oneself from the built world, even briefly, is not madness. It is hygiene. And if something stirs in us that we do not yet understand, let the pines bear witness." None of them were known to dabble in superstition. They dismissed ghost stories, carried no charms, wore no talismans. They were men of letters and science. Yet after they vanished, each family submitted a different explanation for the trip, and each believed theirs was the only truth. The official file notes that 4 letters, one from each man, were postmarked the same day from the same rural outpost. 3 days later, that post office burned to the ground. Cause unrecorded. The clean reputations of the 4 men would become one of the enduring puzzles of the case. There were no signs of desperation or escape. Whatever drew them into the Adirondacks was not a dare, not a flight from scandal. It was something quieter, and as history would suggest, something much harder to find the way back from. The simple map. Miles Pomeroy's map was an exercise in precision, a single thread of ink beginning at the West Brindle outpost, tracing a ridgeline east toward a lake. No forks, no alternate routes. Every mile was marked with a slash, the same mark they intended to carve into birch trunks to guide their return. When the sheriff's team followed that map after the men failed to return, the first two markers matched perfectly straight, deliberate cuts at chest height, the work of a steady hand. At the third, the world began to bend. The slash was 60 yards east of where it should have been carved into a pine instead of a birch. The angle of the cut was reversed. By the fourth mile, the slashes had started to mutate. One curved upward like a question mark. Another was doubled as if struck twice on different days. One wasn't a slash at all, but a ladder of horizontal scores, each one crossed out. There were no footprints, no sign of struggle, only a scrap of paper near the fifth marker in Francis Dow's hand. It does not wish to be followed in sequence. After the sixth marker, the trail lost all sense. Searchers split into three parties. None reached the same place. One group circled back to where they had started, finding the trees now marked differently than before, as if someone had followed behind them, altering the signs. Deputy Langdon's sketch of the markings, reviewed later by cartographers, revealed something unsettling. The trail did not branch randomly. It spiraled. 4 roots peeling away from a single point each, never crossing again. Organically deliberate, he called it before the phrase was crossed out in red ink. Beneath the ink years later, archivists put Miles Pomeroy's original map under ultraviolet light. Beneath the neat, unbroken trail was another drawing, fainter older. This one was a lattice of branching paths, each leading in different directions before the inked-over version erased them. Someone had decided which trail would remain. Someone had rewritten their journey. Whether that decision was made before the men set foot in the woods or after they never came back remains unanswered. It is the first of many contradictions in the record, and perhaps the most damning. Because if the map was altered, then every slash on every tree might have been part of a route no one was meant to retrace. And if the true path was hidden, it wasn't the forest that wanted them lost. The fire was planned. It's tempting to imagine forest fires as accidents, careless campfires, lightning strikes wind, turning a spark into a runaway blaze. But the fire that revealed the tin was no accident. The state's own paperwork says so. It was listed in forestry logs as sanctioned burn sector for the Adirondack Western Plateau. The initiative had been running for weeks, part of a campaign to clear old growth and reduce the risk of uncontrolled wildfires. The burn crew that summer in 1902 was a mix of state employees and contracted laborers, men who knew the feel of a match in their hand and the precise moment to drop it. No one spoke about the plateau until they were standing on it. There the trees grew in spirals, the kind that made your neck ache to follow their twist upward. The rings once counted later were tighter than they should have been, the grain bunched like a fist. Forestry reports mention growth patterns inconsistent with neighboring flora, but give no further commentary, as if to name it more fully would be to admit it was wrong. When the match was struck, the plateau burned like paper. Flames ran in clean lines up the bark, curling needles into black ribbons. The air filled with a heavy metallic scent of burning resin. Then, on the third day, as the embers cooled to ash, a fireman named Coleman saw the corner of an iron box poking through the soil where a birch had fallen. It was square, riveted at the corners, and heavier than it looked. The hinge fought him, then yielded with a gritty sigh. Inside lay the field journal, charred at the edges, but otherwise unmarked, as though the flames had gone around it. Coleman handed it to the foreman, who wrapped it in burlap, and sent it to the Forestry Bureau. From there, it moved quietly to the State Historical Office in Albany. That should have been the end of it. An artifact found, logged, shelved. But someone reading those 41 entries would later note that none of them were written by the same hand. None of them except for a name repeated like a refrain, Francis Dow, the iron box. The iron tin wasn't anything from a standard supply manifest. No quartermaster had signed off on it. No expedition in the 19th century was recorded as carrying one. The archivist who examined it first was puzzled enough to jot a private note in the margin of his intake log container not on federal lists. Possible field fabrication. Paper fibers, test period accurate. Lid hinge inconsistent with manufacturing methods known to region 1850s. That note was later crossed out in heavy black ink before the log went public. It was Elias Grant, the youngest of the 4 missing men, who had the skill to make such a box. Records from his short time at the Albany Mechanics Institute show sketches of riveted hinges, fireproof linings, and insulated sealants. In letters to his sister, he spoke often about the idea that some things decay without ever being touched unless deliberately preserved. The box was his insurance policy against that. Why such protection was necessary for a week-long hiking trip is anyone's guess. But when the box surfaced after half a century, buried under fire and soil, the logic of it seemed undeniable. Without it, the journal would have been ash, the handwriting lost, the contradictions buried forever. The Forestry Bureau handled it like a found coin, briefly noted, then moved on. Only at the Historical Office did its weight seem to matter. The journal's pages were unburned, the ink crisp, the papers scent, dry and dusty. It didn't smell of smoke. Inside the box, in the last pages of the journal, a phrase in faint graphite seemed almost shy in the way it sat in the corner of the paper. You cannot rewalk what was never truly walked. The archivist who first read it under the office's dim yellow lights later described feeling as though the paper were waiting for me to answer it. The 41 entries. 41 entries. 41 different sets of initials. That was the first anomaly that stuck. None of the initials matched exactly the handwriting of the others. Yet some letters seemed borrowed, an F drawn in Francis's style. An S lifted from Samuel's hand, an M that belonged to Miles, but written by someone else entirely. The entries didn't tell a story in the conventional sense. They didn't flow in sequence so much as overlap in strange ways, like looking at multiple photographs of the same moment, each taken from a slightly different angle. In one, Francis described a ridge at dawn. In another, Miles recorded a marsh in the same hour. Samuel noted fog at mid-morning. Elias claimed frost in the grass. And yet the dates aligned. The 14th of August appeared over and over, each time tied to a different weather, a different location, a different sense of direction. Even before modern forensic testing, archivists noticed the inconsistency. When ink analysis came decades later, the problem deepened. Some samples had aged in ways that made sense. Others had decayed more slowly, as though they'd been written years later, but backdated to match the others. One name surfaced more than any other: Francis Dow. Sometimes as the narrator, sometimes as a figure glimpsed in the distance, once as a witness to an event in which he was not otherwise present. His absence and his presence were equally unsteady. The final page. It was faint, almost not there, as though the writer had pressed lightly, afraid to leave too deep an impression. In graphite, without a date or location, the line read, "You cannot rewalk what was never truly walked. It was the only complete sentence on the page. No explanation, no signature. The archivist who found it wrote in his private log that the handwriting was steady but reluctant. The loops closed too early. The descenders in the letters hung as if unsure they belonged on the line at all. To him it read like someone trying to remember how they used to write. The page was catalogued, photographed, and then mysteriously left out of later inventories. By the time researchers filed Freedom of Information requests in 1949, the official reply was simple: no such document currently held in state records. And yet in the logbook of the 1902 fire crew, the day Coleman found the tin is still recorded: item recovered. Tin contents charred book, turned over to state. No inventory number, no chain of custody. The object existed. It was passed from hand to hand, and then it was gone. The name that would not fade. By the time the journal was read in full once and only once, Francis Dow had become the axis around which the others spun. In some entries he was a companion. In others, a distant figure glimpsed through trees. In one written in Miles's hand, Francis was described as if from a newspaper article about a man already gone. There was something deliberate in his elusiveness. His surviving letters, sparse and emotionless, painted him as a man who listened more than he spoke, but not in a way that suggested understanding. He listens in such a way that you feel your words are being set aside, not understood, a colleague once wrote in a recommendation for a teaching post he never took. In the forest, he left nothing like the others did. Samuel left his satchel, Elias his ring of stones, Miles his boots at the ridge. Francis left only a button-clean hole embedded 20 feet up between two ash trunks where no man could have stood. It was as if the forest itself had decided how he would be remembered. The graphite warning. When archivists turned the journal's last leaf, what they saw looked less like a closing thought and more like a boundary marker. The phrase, "You cannot rewalk what was never truly walked," had the quality of something meant to be read only once, perhaps by someone already standing in the wrong place. It was written in graphite, not ink, the strokes faint yet deliberate. Graphite smudges under pressure, but here the words remained sharp as if the paper resisted the natural drag of time. The line sat alone, no date, no location, no flourish. Whoever wrote it had stripped away every extra gesture. Forensic analysts decades later noted the pressure varied mid-word as if the hand had hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the act of remembering how to write the sentence. Archivists tried to place the hand to one of the four men. The closest match was to Francis Dow's script, but it was only close, never exact. Experts described the fit like hearing a familiar voice speaking with an unfamiliar rhythm. The sentence was copied into the archivist's personal notebook, but when researchers tried to find the page in later inspections, it was missing from the bound journal. One insisted they had seen it on the original paper. Another swore the page had been blank. It was as if the warning could be read only when no one was looking for it. 4 households. 4 stories. Each man came from a household that was in its own way untouchable in mid-19th century Albany. Their fathers were pillars of law, medicine, and commerce. Their mothers kept parlors in which reputations were polished like silver. They were not drifters, not rebels. And yet when the sheriff's office began collecting statements after their disappearance, each family gave a different reason for the trip. The Hworths claimed it was for botanical study. The Pomeroys said it was a farewell excursion before Miles took up a teaching position. The Grants insisted it was a hunting trip. The Dows provided no reason at all, only that Francis had been called to the country. Each family was adamant that theirs was the only correct account. None of them knew the others had provided conflicting statements. Then there were the letters, 4 envelopes, one from each man, all postmarked the same day from a rural outpost. Whatever was written in them never reached their intended recipients. 3 days after they were mailed, the post office burned to the ground. The official report gave no cause. It was as though even their final words had been subjected to the same rearrangement that would plague the trails. Samuel's shift. In the early months of their correspondence, Samuel Worth wrote like a man cataloguing the world for a ledger, careful, neat, descriptive. His background in medicine and surveying made his prose efficient, his observations exact. But the letters from the weeks before the trip show a shift. Phrases began to surface that sat uneasily between science and something else. He wrote of sensory duplication of paths that returned in ways that do not match departure. He described moving through spaces that felt aligned in memory, but not in sight. His last surviving note to a friend before departure read, "To remove oneself from the built world, even briefly, is not madness. It is hygiene. And if something stirs in us that we do not yet understand, let the pines bear witness." A psychiatrist reviewing the case in 1917 called the language cognitively dissociative, but his peers criticized the diagnosis as an anachronistic projection. Samuel had no recorded history of delusion. Yet in the wilderness, it would be his satchel, neatly packed untouched, that marked one of the most disturbing shifts in the story. Miles's impossible map. Miles Pomeroy was the son of a judge and a man with a reputation for precision so exact that his professors once said his maps could be read like court transcripts. For the 1859 trip, he drew a master topographic sketch in brown ink. A single trail from the West Brindle outpost to the lake. No forks, no dead ends. Every mile was marked with a slash notation meant to be mirrored on birch trees for the return. But in the papers he left behind, there was another map, one not shown to the others. This sketch depicted a valley absent from any modern map. The elevation lines defied the known grade of the land. A river in his drawing bent backwards on itself, a geographic impossibility. Next to it, in small script, he wrote, "Land feels copied, not mirrored," copied with deliberate faults. When searchers later tried to use his official map, they found the slashes on the trees had shifted. Some were in the wrong place. Some had changed shape entirely. Years later, ultraviolet analysis of the original revealed faint marks beneath the ink-branching paths that had been erased and overwritten with the singular trail. It was as if the route had been edited before it was ever walked. Elias's precaution. The youngest of the four by nearly 4 years, Elias Grant was not a man anyone would have called impractical. He was, however, obsessive in his need to make things last. He designed and built the iron tin that would one day save the journal from fire and wrought a heavy, riveted container more suited to a military dispatch than a week-long excursion into familiar woods. His friends teased him for it. He had, after all, brought a copper kettle engraved with his initials, hardly the gear of a minimalist trekker. But Elias spoke often about preservation, about how some things decay without ever being touched. He was also a compulsive redrafter. Professors at the Albany Mechanics Institute noted that he would make 3 or 4 alternate versions of a blueprint for a space he had only seen once. Once he even designed a one-room house with 4 doors and no windows, explaining every direction should feel false. When his camp was found, weeks after his disappearance, the kettle was empty and scorched, yet there was no ash beneath it. Around the site, stones had been arranged in a ring. In a 1923 photograph of the location, there were 15 stones. Today, there are 6. No one knows who removed the rest or why the formation was there in the first place. Francis the Observer. Francis Dow was the hardest to place. In the limited letters he left behind, there is a striking absence of emotional color. His handwriting was neat, his phrasing measured, but it was as though he were describing a scene through glass untouched by it. Friends remembered him as pleasant, but always slightly apart, a man who listened without engaging. One colleague wrote in a recommendation letter for a teaching post he never accepted, "Francis does not lose his temper. He does not raise his voice. But he listens in such a way that you feel your words are being set aside, not understood." In the Adirondacks, his presence in the journal was equally elusive. Some entries had him at the center of events, speaking with the others. In others, he appeared only in passing, observed at a distance, or referenced as if reading about himself in a newspaper. His was the only name to appear more than once across all 41 entries, but it never settled into a single role. After the disappearance, no object of his was found at any of the primary sites. Samuel had left a satchel, Miles his boots, Elias the ring of stones. Francis left nothing, at least nothing that could be reached. Only a single coat button engraved faintly on the underside with his initials lodged 20 feet above the ground between the twisted trunks of 2 ash trees. There were no climbing marks on the bark, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had stood beneath it. When a later search team attempted to retrieve it, they found the trees had grown together, swallowing the button deeper into the seam. By 1915, the button had shifted position higher than before, though the trees had not thickened in proportion. It was the kind of detail Francis might have appreciated, the appearance of something in plain sight that nonetheless remained out of reach. No superstition. One of the more persistent myths about the case is that the men carried talismans or that they believed the woods to be haunted. The truth is the opposite. In their letters, they dismissed ghost stories. They carried no charms, wore no religious medals. Their gear lists were practical rations, rifles, lanterns, journals, compasses. They were men of logic and science, not folklore. And yet after they vanished, the accounts given by their families diverged so completely that each might have been describing a different journey. The Horths believed it was a study trip. The Pomeroys insisted it was a farewell excursion. The Grants thought it was for hunting. The Dows offered no reason at all. None of the families knew the others had said something different. This is one of the earliest fractures in the record, a kind of narrative version of the trail anomalies to come. Each account was self-contained, each certain of its truth, and none could be reconciled with the others. The 4 letters. If the last trace of the 4 men had been the letters they sent, the case might have been stranger still. 4 envelopes, one from each man, were postmarked the same day from the same rural outpost. Whatever they contained was never read by the families. 3 days later, the post office burned to the ground. The fire report gave no cause, only noting that the structure was a total loss. No records of incoming or outgoing mail survived. The surviving postal log lists the 4 letters in sequence, each addressed to a different Albany household. It is tempting to imagine that the letters contained some kind of warning, but no fragment of paper was ever recovered from the site. The simultaneous timing of the postmarks raises an obvious question. If the men truly left the trail together, why would they have mailed their letters from a location not on their planned route? And if they did not leave together, how did all 4 letters bear the same date? The same ink, the same clerk's hand. A modest route. The Adirondack sector they intended to cross in August of 1859 was not an untamed wilderness. It was dense, yes, but bordered by rail lines to the south and active timber routes to the north. Their route, as planned, was straightforward, what one searcher would later call a study in isolation without isolation itself. Miles's map, the one he shared with the others, was clean, a single line, no forks. Each mile marked with a slash, meant to be cut into a birch tree. It was the kind of trail any experienced hiker could walk without losing the way, which is why the search team's findings were so disturbing. The first 2 markers matched perfectly. The third was wrong east of its intended spot, cut into a pine at a reversed angle. By the 4th mile, the markings had changed shape. One curved upward, another was doubled, one was replaced entirely by a set of horizontal scores that had been crossed out. By the 6th mile, the trail had stopped behaving like a trail at all. It does not wish to be followed. Near the 5th marker, a scrap of paper was found in Francis Dow's hand. The note read, "It does not wish to be followed," in sequence. It was written in small, precise letters, as though the act of writing had been hurried, but the penmanship restrained. The meaning was unclear. Did it refer to the trail, the forest? Something else entirely? Search parties split after the 6th marker. One group moved north toward the ridge. Another veered southwest toward the marsh. A third tried to follow what looked like a fresh set of slashes, only to find themselves back at their starting point, though the trees behind them now bore clean new cuts where there had been none before. Deputy Langdon, tasked with mapping the slashes spatially, later produced a sketch that startled the cartographers who reviewed it. The lines didn't branch or fork. They spiraled 4 routes, peeling away from one point, never crossing again. The phrase Langdon first used to describe it, organically deliberate, was crossed out in red ink in the official report. The ridge. Miles's boots. The ridge wasn't on their declared itinerary. Steep granite flanked by scrub pine and bent juniper, it was considered impassable in summer. And yet on September 7th, 1859, the search log notes the discovery of neatly placed belongings at its western overlook: a folded wool jacket, an empty canteen, and a pair of boots aligned side-by-side toes, pointers toward the drop. There were no drag marks, no signs of a fall. The soil at the edge was undisturbed, as though no one had ever stood there. If Miles Pomeroy had approached the precipice, he had done so without leaving a single trace of movement. Beside the boots lay a page torn from the shared field journal, held in place by a flat stone. The handwriting was confirmed as Miles's, but the sentence trailed off. Mid-thought, I see it across the way in my own posture. Investigators speculated he meant a distant figure, or perhaps a reflection. But in his earlier entries, Miles had written about a ridge that repeats itself as you turn your head, an echo, not of sound, but of placement. In his folded jacket pocket, a contour sketch showed the overlook drawn twice, once in solid outline, once in dotted, labeled if already seen. In 1912, a government survey photographed the ridge from across the valley. At first glance, the rock face seemed ordinary, but overlaying it against the overlook revealed something uncanny. The shapes matched stone for stone crevice, for crevice like a mirrored duplicate placed across from itself. Miles was a man of precision. His final letter to his father, postmarked the day after he was presumed missing, read, "The wilderness does not hide anything. It merely delays the agreement on what was seen." The letter was mailed from a post station over 30 miles from the ridge, and no one recorded him arriving there. The boots remain in his family's possession. Their soles are unworn. The clay on the heels matches soil from a creek bed 6 miles north, nowhere near the ridge. The marsh, Samuel's satchel. 7 miles south of the last confirmed marker lay a marsh that appeared on none of their maps. Flat reed-choked, its still water reflected clouds that never moved. The first searchers hesitated at its edge, not because the ground was soft, but because the place felt unfamiliar in a forest they thought they knew. Samuel Hworth's satchel was found in a dry pocket by the marsh. Its straps were intact, the canvas barely weathered. Inside, a waterlogged copy of Virgil, a glass lens wrapped in linen, 2 sticks of graphite, and several folded pages from the shared field journal. At first, his entries were orderly, precise descriptions of flora, soil, saturation, bird calls. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting shifted. Lines slanted, words crowded. The content turned from description to orientation, heading east again, or what I believe is east past the same split cedar, twice, but the bark has changed. It remembers our steps. We cannot rewalk them. The final line was in darker ink, the letters larger, breaking the margins. Beneath it, the paper was torn, not as though cut from above, but pushed outward from beneath, as if something under the page had strained to surface. 2 weeks later, another party found 3 small stone stacks equidistant from the marsh, each aligned to cardinal directions that no longer matched magnetic north. The satchel was catalogued without issue, but when requested for a 1956 exhibit, the county archive claimed it had never been logged. The stone formations. The stone stacks found near the marsh were dismissed at first simple trail cairns, perhaps. But aerial photographs, decades later, revealed their placement formed an equilateral triangle with the marsh at its center. Each stack was only a man's palm in width. No markings, no lichen. They appeared recent, but the surrounding vegetation was undisturbed. The alignment to cardinal directions was an illusion. Compasses in the area gave shifting readings. Some speculated the formations were remnants of an older surveying method, but the stones were too small to serve as markers for distance or elevation. Others proposed a symbolic purpose, but there is no local tradition matching their design. The oddest detail came from the third stack. Beneath it in the soil was a layer of clay matching that found on the heels of Miles's boots, miles away from the marsh. No explanation connects the two. When researchers tried to revisit the formations in the 1970s, they found only one remaining. The other 2 had disappeared without trace. No displaced earth, no scattered stones. The clearing. Elias's ring. The site known as the clearing was no more than a hollow in the trees, its canopy unusually thin. Here the searchers found evidence of Elias Grant, a fragment of wool from his coat caught on a snapped branch, and his distinctive copper kettle, a wedding gift from his sister, its interior scorched but containing no ash. Around the site, 15 stones formed a perfect ring. In his 1923 forestry survey photograph, the formation is clear, symmetrical, precise. Today, only 6 stones remain. No erosion or animal activity accounts for the missing 9. Also found were torn fragments of a topographic map, the lines not matching any known terrain. One fragment bore 3 concentric circles labeled Ridge Marsh and Fork in the same careful hand as earlier journal entries. Another fragment depicted a stairwell etched into a hillside, though no such feature exists within 15 miles. The most intact fragment carried the warning, "Do not redraw from memory." The fork, Francis's button. At the fork, where 2 game trails diverged before ending in thicket, searchers spotted something glinting 20 feet above the ground, wedged between the trunks of 2 ash trees that had grown together. It was a coat button, civilian make, engraved on the underside with FD. There were no marks of climbing. The gap where the button sat was too narrow for it to have fallen and too high to have been placed by someone standing. It appeared to have been embedded there as the trees grew. When photographed in 1915, the button was higher than in the original report, though the tree's overall growth did not match the change. Later, at the original trailhead, a returned parcel addressed to Francis's sister was found. Inside was a single page in Francis's tentative but lucid handwriting. "I have taken the wrong path, but I do not mean that I regret it. I mean the path itself was wrong. It moved, or I did, and now I am waiting to see which one corrects itself." The return address bore no name, only a stamped symbol of 2 curved lines forming a fork beneath which was the number 0. The journal's intended purpose. Elias had been the one to suggest a strict protocol for the shared field journal before they ever set foot on the trail. 1 entry per evening, name signed at the end. Ink rationed for precision, each page dated. In theory, it would serve as both a scientific log and a collective memory, an impartial record of their week in the Adirondacks. The agreement was pragmatic. Samuel's background in observation, Miles's mapping skill, Elias's attention to design, and Francis's detached clarity of thought meant that together they could produce something both accurate and enduring. It would be a document as precise as any expedition's log, useful to others long after their return. But by the time the journal resurfaced, decades later, scorched, sealed in its iron box, it was no longer a linear record. It had become something else, a stack of overlapping realities, each signed in a different hand, but all dated to the same days. The farther into the journal one read, the less it seemed to care about documenting what happened, and the more it appeared to be writing what each man believed had happened. If Elias had designed the journal as a bulwark against memory's decay, it had instead become the perfect container for preserving contradictions. The 4 versions of August 14th, page 17, holds the first clear fracture. Miles's entry for August 14th describes the ridge under a cloudless sky, 3 deer by the creek bed, an unsettling silence between the trees. 4 pages later, Samuel writes of the same morning as overcast, distant thunder, rolling in heavy fog obscuring the trail. There is no mention of the ridge or deer, only the sound of dripping leaves. Then comes Elias's version. Also, August 14th, but now they are in a clearing with broken ferns and frost, a meteorological impossibility for that season and region. He writes, "Francis will not come down from the ridge. We've already been here, though the trail turns opposite from before." Finally, Francis's entry, 3 lines, no weather, no direction. We spoke the same words again this morning, but not in the same order. Miles asked me what day it was. I said, "Still." The 4 accounts are not variations. They are entirely separate events occupying the same time stamp. The handwriting and the ink, Francis's entry for August 14th, is where handwriting analysis finds its sharpest anomaly. The letters are still neat, but the pressure changes mid-word, and there are micro-delays between strokes like someone mimicking his style. In the 1970s, forensic testing revealed that each entry for that date had been written with a different pen nib. More troubling, the rate of ink decay didn't align chronologically. Francis's sample had aged at least 12 years more slowly than the others, despite being on the same paper. This raised questions the State Historical Office refused to answer. If the entries weren't all written in sequence, when were they written, and by whom? The refusal came in the form of bureaucratic language, ongoing verification of record integrity. In practice, it meant researchers were given only partial scans versions that differed, depending on which institution they came from, the divergent scans. The Adirondack Preservation Board received a scan of Elias's Marsh entry in which he referred to it as the Second Lowland. The Albany Archives version calls it Our First Return. The difference seems small until you remember there was no return scheduled, only a straight route in and back along the same path. Second Lowland suggests sequence. First return implies repetition of an earlier point in a journey that should not have had one. Other subtle differences appeared. Words rearranged, line breaks shifted, even the tone of certain sentences softened or sharpened between versions. The conclusion was unavoidable. More than one final version of the journal existed, which, if either matched what had been written in the woods, no one could say. The final shared entry. The last entry in the journal carries no date and no signature. The ink fades halfway down the page, but under a bleak light, one sentence remains visible. No matter who holds the pen, it remembers the day differently. It is the kind of line that reads like resignation. By then, the journal was no longer four voices in harmony. It was a chorus of separate realities bound together, each insisting on its own truth, each undermining the others. Who or what was the journal actually documenting? And when did it stop being an account of events and start being a record of perception bending to each author's memory? The archivist who last read it in full wrote in his private log, "The journal is not just a record of where they went. It is a place they went." The tracker's account. Jacob Thinate. Jacob Thinate was not a man prone to embellishment. Among the forestry patrols in the border militia, his skill as a Mohawk guide was respected to the point of quiet reverence. He could read the slope of fern to find a spring, distinguish an elk's trail from a deer's by the wind's direction, and move through forest without snapping a twig. When the final search team requested his help in September 1859, it was because they knew if anyone could find the missing men, it would be him. His name appears only once in the official record, buried in the back pages of the 1860 field log, labeled simply Native Tracker, supplemental testimony, not formally entered. The account was verbal, transcribed in the cramped hand of a deputy clerk on stained paper, later folded and misfiled among mineral rights surveys. According to the transcript, Thinate moved ahead of the group to scout a split in the rock path near the western ridge. The fog was heavy, the air still. Then he stopped. Ahead of him on the narrow spine of the ridge were four shadows, not people shadows. Each faced in a different direction. One crouched, another stood rigid. One turned as though looking back, the fourth fading and reappearing in place. He drew the pattern in the margin, 4 lines angling away from a central point, one darker than the others. They were ahead of me, he said, but none led to the others. No shared path. When the deputy pressed him for an explanation, Theenat grew silent. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Sometimes the forest remembers more than one version of you." His statement was never entered into the main report. The page was marked in red pencil, "Disregard." Interpretive, not evidentiary. The return of page. 42. In the spring of 1870, the journal was removed from storage for what should have been a routine cataloging initiative. It had been locked for years in an iron archival tube inside a cabinet at the New York State Historical Office. Archivist Linwood Clark noted nothing unusual on April 12th. Pages intact. Ink stable. No further deterioration. But the next morning he filed a second report marked Incident. Unshelved materials. Page 42, the folio, long listed as blank, now bore fresh writing. The date at the top was August 14th, 1859. The ink was still tacky, the edge of the page faintly stuck to its opposite leaf. The text was short. There are still places not meant for shared memory. We went in for, but left in more. Signed, F.D. Later analysis found anomalies in the signature, variations in pen pressure and spacing that suggested imitation rather than authorship. Stranger still, the ink's composition was high in tannic acid, but contained no iron sulfate, a mix that should have faded over time. It hadn't. 2 weeks after filing his report, Clark requested restricted access to the journal. His request was denied, then removed from the record. By July of that year, his employment file simply ended. No resignation letter, no pension record, just the note deceased. No burial registered through this office. The birch with 4 slashes. By 1921, the disappearance had faded to local folklore. Then, during a state trail expansion project, a civilian survey group encountered a birch tree of extraordinary size. 4 feet in diameter, its bark pale and smooth, except for 4 deliberate slashes, each facing a different direction. The slashes were too fresh, sap curled at the edges, the bark not yet sealing. The group had carried no cutting tools, and no other hikers had passed in the preceding days. Weather records showed 3 days of steady rain, yet the cuts were bone dry. Edwin Malloy, a retired cartographer leading the group, photographed the tree. In his letter to the Trail Commission, he wrote, "The cuts are precise, each angled outward from the center, as if not meant to guide a return, but to repel it." The spacing suggests 4 authors, but the age of the bark betrays a single time of entry. Botanists later noted that no birch of that diameter could have grown in the 12 years since the area had last been photographed, and in the 1909 image the glade where it stood had been empty. When rangers returned in 1923 to locate the tree, it was gone. The glade remained, but no stump, no roots, no disturbance in the soil marked where it had stood. The 5th trail. In 1943, the military conducted an aerial survey of the inner basin for wartime terrain modeling. Most of the negatives show ordinary forest ridge marsh and river. But in file, 4B7 marked topographic irregularities. Sector F, a faint 5th trail appears. It doesn't start where the others do. It doesn't follow established terrain. Instead, it curves gracefully, then cuts across all 4 known routes the men took in 1859, intersecting them, not paralleling. It ends or begins at a clearing marked by a square stone. On the photograph, the stone is bleached, uncracked, and free of moss. Carved into its surface, we left in pieces. Military geologists confirmed the stone hadn't been moved in over 80 years. The fifth trail doesn't exist on the ground. Hikers sent to trace it found no path at all. Botanists suggested it might be a discoloration visible only from above due to soil differences. But its curvature and its exact placement against the other four routes defied that explanation. When plotted with the four original trails, the fifth formed a spiral not inward but outward, a dispersal rather than a convergence. The parcel and the spiral. By 1978, the state had digitized much of its historic cartography. An intern replotting the 1859 search grids on modern topography noticed the last known locations of each man formed a perfect logarithmic spiral. Each point expanded evenly from a central void. The center of that spiral lay inside Parcel 23G, fenced off by the state in the 1960s for erosion prevention. No further explanation was given. A single photograph from 1953 shows the clearing smooth circular, 60 feet across. At its center sits a pale object that casts no shadow. When the intern tried to reach the site in 1984, he found a 12-foot fence topped with barbed wire. No patrols, no cameras, just a sign, no public entry. Conservation Research Site. He walked away along a trail he didn't remember taking, arriving back at his car in half the expected time. Years later, when asked about the spiral, he said they didn't just get lost. They were rearranged by something that doesn't want to be symmetrical. Forestry anomalies. 1937. It began quietly buried in the routine paperwork of the Forestry Service. In 1937, trail rehabilitation crews were sent into the southern Adirondacks to realign old paths with updated topographic overlays. They carried calibrated compasses, 2 theodolites, aerial photos, and state-issued maps. On the first day inside the sector designated Parcel 9RB, the instruments began to fail. The first recorded incident came from junior surveyor Clayton Emma's compass spun clockwise, then countered, stabilized at 130 degrees opposite of solar direction. Rechecked twice. Same result. Air still. No iron deposits in soil sample. The notation was marked equipment malfunction in the official report. But then 6 more incidents followed over the next 2 weeks, bearings that reversed mid-measurement markers that appeared in photographs but not in the field, and one unsettling report of walking the same 200-yard loop 3 times before encountering a freshly placed trail sign behind them, despite no one having carried it. Only one of these incidents made it into the public summary. The rest were buried in internal memos. The official forestry file for Parcel 9RB ends with a bland conclusion. Terrain unstable. Recommend limited work until further surveying. Warren Elkins's withdrawal. Warren Elkins was a contracted cartographer from Utica, known for precision bordering on obsession. He worked alone in a ranger cabin near the Parcel 9RB boundary, compiling 2 working maps over 4 nights. On the 5th day, he returned his notes with a letter of resignation. Last night the paths made over. I did not redraw them, but when I returned to my sketch, the routes had changed position. North no longer aligned. There are now 5 trails on the page. I only remember drawing 4. His maps were archived under the label Abandoned Draft, Parcel 9RB. When examined decades later under ultraviolet light, the ink for the 5th trail fluoresced differently with softer stroke pressure and a narrower pen nib than the other lines. Elkins refused follow-up correspondence. In a later interview, a colleague recalled him saying, "That 5th trail wasn't mine, but it was in my hand." Parcel 9RB restricted. By 1942, the Forestry Division quietly restricted public access to Parcel 9B, citing terrain instability and incomplete logging paths. A circular perimeter was drawn on internal maps, though no official hazard, landslide, sinkhole, fire risk was recorded. Compass failures continued near the perimeter well into the 1970s, when GPS began replacing traditional navigation. Even then, satellite mapping in the area often froze or returned mismatched coordinates, as though the system could not decide which version of the land to believe. The ranger cabin used by Elkins was dismantled in 1955. Not demolished, but relocated piece by piece to a site 15 miles west. No photographs of its original foundation survive, and no paperwork documents the move. Only a scrap of a signboard found half buried at the edge of the old forest road remains. The carving is faint but legible. This place does not care if you return. The 1978 Spiral Discovery. In 1978, during a statewide digitization of historical search maps, an intern was tasked with overlaying the 1859 disappearance search grids onto modern topographic maps. The intention was routine training materials for rescue teams, but as the intern layered the coordinates of each man's last known location, something emerged. The points formed a perfect logarithmic spiral, each segment expanding evenly from a central void. The geometry was too precise for coincidence. The center of the spiral matched the fenced Parcel 23G, a site already closed off since the early 1960s. Officially, the closure was for erosion prevention. Unofficially, no one could explain why the state had fenced off an empty clearing. The intern submitted the spiral overlay with his report. The printout was stamped visual distortion, reject. His name was removed from the project log. Years later, he would say the forest wasn't hiding them, it was placing them, the clearing that cast. No shadow parcel. 23G's central clearing measures 60 feet across, ringed by cedar. It does not appear on public hiking maps. In the only surviving photograph taken from a ranger plane in 1953, a pale square object sits at its center. When the negative was enhanced in the 1980s, the object had no visible shadow. Geologists brought in to inspect the image suggested glare, overexposure, or a trick of the light. But no other object in the frame exhibited the same anomaly. There is no record of any team physically visiting the clearing after the fence went up. One retired forestry employee recalled trying in 1965 only to walk the perimeter and come back to the same point, without realizing I'd turned. It is said, though never officially recorded, that the clearing is silent, not in the absence of birdsong sense, but in the way a sealed room is silent. An airlessness that presses at the eardrums. The fence around nothing. By the time the fence went up around Parcel 23G in the early 1960s, few outside the forestry and land survey offices even knew the designation existed. It was a plain chain-link barrier 12 feet high, topped with 3 strands of barbed wire. No gates, no signage beyond a single bolted warning, no public entry, conservation research site. No cameras watched it, no patrols walked its perimeter. Its presence was silent, inert, yet those who approached it reported an odd disorientation. One hiker who claimed to have followed the old timber line to the barrier described walking its length only to end up where he started without realizing he had turned. The state's official justification, erosion prevention, was paper-thin. There were no unstable slopes, no signs of washout or sediment runoff. Satellite imagery later showed the clearing inside had no drainage patterns at all, as if the soil itself resisted movement. A handful of local residents swore they'd seen dim lights flicker beyond the fence at night, cold bluish pulses that blinked in no pattern they recognized. None of these sightings were reported in official channels. Perhaps no one wanted to be the first to put in writing that something was wrong with an empty clearing. Rearranged, not lost. The narrative of the 4 missing men often reduces them to a simple fate lost in the wilderness. But those who have studied the journal, the maps, the anomalies, and the geometry of their last known positions know better. The spiral formed by their locations isn't a random scattering. It's deliberate, logarithmic measured expanding outward from the parcel 23G clearing. Each man's last trace marks a point on that spiral, like beads placed by an unseen hand. One geospatial analyst, reviewing the aerial overlays in the 1980s, wrote in his notes, "If this is a natural feature, it behaves unnaturally. Trails do not organize around absences. This one appears to." The implication is chilling. The men weren't lost. They were positioned. The journal entries, with their overlapping dates and conflicting events, don't read like mistakes. They read like iterations of a route designed to scatter them away from each other in a controlled pattern. The question then becomes not where they went, but who or what was arranging them. The 7th mark. The story's last line, if it can be called, that doesn't come from an official report or a witness statement. It comes from the final note appended to the digital transcript of the case in 1978, attributed to no one unsigned. The archivists who maintain the file call it the 7th mark. If you're still with us, trace your own mark below. Some paths are walked only once but recorded many times. The note reads like an invitation and a warning. In its phrasing, there's the faint echo of the journal's earliest pages, structured, deliberate, but also something Francis Dow might have written in his clipped, elliptical style. The 7th mark implies there are more than the original 4 trails, more than the 5th path seen in the aerial photos, more than the spiral's 6 visible points. It hints at another position, another step in a sequence we cannot fully see. And if that's true, then the disappearance of Worth, Pomeroy, Grant, and Dow may not be the final chapter at all, only one turn in a pattern that has been repeating quietly in the Adirondack wilderness for over a century. Perhaps that's why the journal changes when no one is looking for it. Why maps redraw themselves. Why trails appear only to vanish. Because somewhere the 7th mark is waiting for the next set of footsteps. The Macabre History of the 4 friends who never took the same trail. Twice. The drawer was supposed to be sealed. A grey industrial cabinet in the State Historical Office, the kind that held artifacts too strange for public display and too unresolved for outright disposal. Inside, buried among brittle envelopes and mislabeled folders, lay a journal long thought complete, long thought irrelevant. It had been shelved years ago after a perfunctory review labeled it inconclusive field documentation. When the lid came off, nothing seemed unusual until the archivist turned to page 42. It had always been logged as blank, a pale sheet with a faint stain brittle at the edges. Now words stood in fresh, wet ink, the edges glistening under the desk lamp. The handwriting was not one style, but many as if spliced together from different authors' hands. Experts would later agree it was no forgery. It bore the muscle memory of genuine writing, but from whom no one could say. At the bottom, in darker ink that should not have survived from the 19th century, was a single line we left together, but not from the same place. The date above it was August 14th, 1859. the day 4 young men vanished in the Adirondack wilderness, a fire in the mountains. The journal's path into that drawer began in the summer of 1902 during a sanctioned, state-supervised burn on a remote plateau. The forestry crews noticed the pines there grew in unnatural spirals, their rings wound too tight for the species, the bark straining as though resisting something within. No one spoke of it. On the 3rd day, as the fire cooled to smoldering ash, a fireman named Coleman spotted the corner of an iron box protruding from the soil beneath a fallen birch. It was square, riveted, heavy. The rusted hinge resisted before groaning open. Inside lay a leather-bound field journal. The cover was blistered edges, curled from heat, but the inner pages were untouched. Forestry procedure dictated such finds be handed to the Bureau. The journal was wrapped in burlap logged and sent to Albany, where it sat for 3 weeks in an intake queue, unacknowledged, before an archivist finally examined it. His note later redacted, "Red container does not match any known federal or state expedition manifest. Paper fibers test consistent with mid-19th century. Possible fabrication, though content predates known activity in the sector." The journal held 41 entries each, initialed by a different hand. Only one name appeared more than once: Francis Dow. The final page in faint graphite bore no date, only "You cannot rewalk what was never truly walked." 4 names, 4 reputations: Samuel Worth, Miles Pomeroy, Elias Grant, and Francis Dow were products of Albany's respectable households, fathers of law and medicine, mothers who presided over parish boards. In the 5 years before their disappearance, they had no debts, scandals, or illnesses. They were childhood acquaintances whose paths diverged in education and profession, only to converge again in the late summer of 1859. Letters between them suggest they sought not adventure, but something unstructured, a final excursion before the obligations of career and family name set in. Samuel, in a note later used in a missing persons affidavit, wrote, "To remove oneself from the built world, even briefly, is not madness. It is hygiene. And if something stirs in us that we do not yet understand, let the pines bear witness." None were superstitious. They dismissed folklore carried no charms. And yet after they vanished, each family submitted a different reason for the trip, none matching the others, each convinced theirs was correct. 4 letters from the men were postmarked the same day from the same rural outpost. 3 days later, the post office burned down. The cause was never recorded. The map that would not stay. Still, their route was simple. Begin at the West Brindle outpost, follow a ridgeline east toward a lake. No forks, no alternate paths. Miles, the group's cartographer, had marked each mile with a slash to be cut into birch trunks for the return. When the sheriff's team retraced the map, the first 2 markers matched perfectly. At the 3rd, the slash was 60 yards east, cut into a pine at a reversed angle. By the 4th mile, the markings had changed. One curved upward, another doubled a third, replaced by horizontal scores that were later crossed out. Near the 5th marker, a scrap of paper in Francis's hand read, "It does not wish to be followed in sequence." Deputy Langdon's spatial sketch of the markings revealed not branching but a spiral 4 routes peeling away from one point, never crossing again. His phrase, organically deliberate, was struck out in red ink. Later, ultraviolet analysis of Miles's original map revealed fainter, older lines, multiple branches erased and overwritten with a single route. 4 sites. 4 remains: the ridge, Miles's boots, a steep granite outcrop not on their itinerary. At its overlook, searchers found a folded jacket, empty canteen, and boots aligned side by side at the drop. The soil was undisturbed. Beside them, a journal page. I see it across the way in my own posture. In his pocket, a sketch of the ridge drawn twice solid outline and dotted labeled if already seen. The marsh, Samuel's satchel, 7 miles south of the last marker, an unmapped marsh. Samuel's satchel lay in a dry pocket, contents undisturbed. His early entries described flora and bird calls. Later ones documented orientation. Passed the same split cedar twice, but the bark has changed. It remembers our steps. The clearing, Elias's ring. A thin canopied hollow containing a fragment of Elias's coat and his copper kettle scorched but with no ash. 15 stones formed a ring. Today, only 6 remain. Map fragments showed ridge marsh and fork in concentric circles, and one warning: do not redraw from memory. The fork, Francis's button. At a natural divide 20 feet up between 2 ash trunks, a coat button engraved FD. No climbing marks. Later, a returned parcel addressed to his sister contained a note: I've taken the wrong path. It moved, or I did. The return address was a stamped fork symbol over the number 0. The journal fractures. Elias had proposed 1 entry per night, dated and signed. But by mid-August, the protocol dissolved. 4 separate entries for August 14th describe 4 incompatible mornings ridge, under a clear sky ridge under fog frost in a clearing, and an exchange about the word still. Forensic tests revealed each entry used a different pen nib, and Francis's ink decayed 12 years slower than the others. Multiple scans of the same page from different archives showed altered wording: second lowland in one, first return in another. The final entry, undated and unsigned, reads under oblique light. No matter who holds the pen, it remembers the day differently. The tracker's shadows. Mohawk guide Jacob Thinnate told of seeing 4 shadows on the ridge, each facing a different way. One crouched, one rigid, one looking back, one fading in and out. They were ahead of me, but none led to the others. When pressed, he added, sometimes the forest remembers more than one version of you. His account was marked disregard, interpretive, not evidentiary. Page 42 returns. In 1870, archivist Linwood Clark found fresh ink on the once blank page. 42, there are still places not meant for shared memory. We went in 4, but left in more. Signed FD. The ink's composition didn't match any in the collection and showed no fading. Weeks later, Clark requested restricted access to the journal. His request was denied. By July, his employment record ended abruptly. Deceased. No burial registered through this office. Later signs, 1921, a birch tree 4 feet in diameter, 4 fresh slashes facing outward. Photographed by Edwin Malloy, who wrote, the spacing suggests 4 authors, but the bark's age betrays a single time of entry. When rangers returned 2 years later, the tree was gone. 1943. Aerial survey revealed a 5th trail intersecting the 4 known routes, ending at a square stone inscribed, "We left in pieces." The stone was removed without record. 1978. A digitization project revealed the last known locations of the 4 men formed a perfect logarithmic spiral, expanding from a central void, parcel 23G fenced since the 1960s, for erosion prevention. The 7th mark. The case's final note appears only in the digital file unsigned. If you're still with us, trace your own mark below. Some paths are walked only once but recorded many times. The spiral's geometry suggests the men weren't lost, they were positioned. The journal's shifting entries are not errors but versions. The fifth trail was not a path but an arrangement. The seventh mark implies there is another position still unfilled, and somewhere in the Adirondack wilderness, the center of that spiral waits silent, fenced and watching for the next set of footsteps.